So I think moving on more towards the sort of diplomacy as a topic, which is of course very much related to the current exhibition here in the gallery at the Brazilian Embassy. So you contributed to the catalogue of this embassy with a really beautiful text, and you finished your text dedicated to the current exhibition catalogue with a powerful and compelling conclusion. The art of diplomacy teaches us a lot about Brazil, a country which does not only want to be seen as a military power, but also wishes to be recognized for its trailblazing ability in both art and also diplomacy to speak up in the face of global tyranny. I thought it was very interesting. That's how you conclude the article. Looking in retrospect, do you not think that the Vargas government rather adopted a pragmatic approach in joining the Allied forces, sending them the armed forces to Italy to fight the Nazis back, as opposed to be openly shocked and horrified by the brutality and atrocities of the Nazi regime, which back then he would have been aware, in particular against the Jews?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think the first thing we should take into consideration is that it's not so easy to make black and white picture of what was the decision to join or to engage in a war. You can support without support, you can acknowledge without acknowledge. So diplomacy, especially around decisions of wars, are never an easy decision to make. We need to put in this picture also a second very important character, both for the Brazilian engagement in the war and for this exhibition. That's Oswaldo Aranha, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vargas during a certain period, who was behind, because of him this exhibition happened basically also. And also we need to look at his dialogues with the allies in order to bring Brazil as a military contributor to the war too. I think this is a very important element to put here. That's Aranha, who looked much more globally, while Vargas looked much more internally to Brazil. That's one important point to have here. The second point is that, for example, USA didn't join the war because of the atrocities committed against the Jews by Germany, but was motivated by other reasons, because also they were attacking Pearl Harbor. And so the question of putting a country in the war because of something that happened to another people, it's a very difficult decision to be made.
It's a moral.
It's
it moral, a moral case.
Exactly. It's pragmatically speaking, a country will just not join the war of somebody else just because of an atrocity. That will be very rare. Unless you suffer an aggression, you are not putting all your efforts into a war. Of course, when we write the macro history, we can include that as a good motivation, and will be good for our history books and for the in the future generations look back and say how we engaged to the war to save the world from the tyranny, etc. But yeah, it is a pragmatical decision always. But I would like to return to the figure of Aranha, who was for me here the key element in this arrangement, in this concert, putting Brazil part of these global players during the Second World War, both, as I said in my text to the catalogue, both proposing, suggesting, encouraging the Brazilian engagement with troops in the theatre of operation in Italy, and also provoking this exhibition to come here, to show that Brazil was a nation that could be part of this concert of great nations in 1944.
Of liberal democracies. No, absolutely. In fact, you touched upon a very interesting point there, which was, I suppose, perceptions of anti-Semitism, which unfortunately, very sadly, is only, seems to be on the rise again here in contemporary reality. But focusing on the actual exhibition,
Yeah.
the original catalogue in 1944, which had an introduction by a member of the British upper class, and I'd like to kind of read it out to you, but it is quite extraordinary. It sounds pretty anti-Semitic, and I'll read it to you. That's British upper class critic Sidwell, and he says, "The progress of painting has been fast on this prolific soil, so fast that we may hope it will become slower and more serious." It's very patronizing. Up to this present, the influences have come from foreign exiles and from Brazilians returned from Paris. In the first respect, it might be said that the foreign blood has not been so far of first-rate quality. He's referring here to Jews and to people like Roberto Bullemarx, for instance, who had a Jewish father and a Roman Catholic mother. It's pretty anti-Semitic, and that's a British man from the British upper classes in 1944, in the middle of the war, whilst those atrocities were happening. So the perceptions of, of Jews and Jewish people, very sadly, absolutely awful, so across the board. And also bringing another person, the ambassador and former minister of Brazil, Rubens Recupero, who wrote a book, was published recently, The Diplomacy in the Construction of Brazil, which he basically sort of talks about the history of Brazilian diplomacy between 1750 to 2016. Very interesting book. He does talk a lot about Osvaldo Aranha and his huge importance, as you've mentioned, in sort of bringing Brazil to the liberal allied forces. But if it wasn't for Aranha, who was, in a very weird way, very close to Vargas, Vargas would not have perhaps taken that direction. Vargas made some pretty controversial speeches just before Brazil joined the allied forces, which could also be considered very anti-Semitic, and he makes references to Jews. Because of Aranha, Brazil accepted 9,000 Jews between 1938 and 1941, but actually less than Argentina and certainly in the United States. And the extradition of communist Jewish women, Elise Ewert and Olga Benadio, back to Germany, and they were killed. So there was certainly in Brazil, and not only in Brazil, sort of an anti-Semitic discourse happening, which we cannot deny from our history.
Absolutely.
And if it wasn't for Osvaldo Aranha, then the history could have been much darker. Don't you think so?
He's, as I said, a particular figure that I think is still not so well studied and valued in Brazilian history. All these elements you mentioned here made us remind again to write the macro history after the events and after all the tragedy of the Holocaust, in which we need to put us in a position. It's so easy because, we sent troops, so we can say that we were defending the values of democracy and again defending or fighting for the end of the Nazism in Germany, who was provoking extermination of the Jewish people. But policies of anti-Semitism were current in Brazil as in many other countries. So racial segregation, and especially towards Jewish people, were common in US, in Britain.
Such as Sitwell's.
Exactly, and look at what happened in France too, that the country was divided very clearly towards the question of the Jewish people. So it's so interesting, this game for Brazil, because it was an internal fight politically and diplomatically. We had, during the war, we had João Guimarães Rosa, our famous writer of O Grande Sertão Veredas, as consul in Hamburg, issuing visas illegally to Jewish to escape to Brazil. He and his wife Araci. We had Santiago Dantas in Paris.
The ambassador, the Brazilian ambassador to Paris.
Exactly.
For 20 years.
Who escaped to the south when Paris was occupied. He was, until his last minute there, issuing visas
Jewish refugees.
Almost illegally for Jewish refugees. Yeah.
Against the will of Vargas, for instance.
Exactly, yeah. And we had some episodes of that. And the question of Oswaldo Aranha is peculiar. Oswaldo Aranha is the one who leads the vote in the United Nations Assembly for the creation of Israel state. So it is so peculiar that this man, he probably, I really don't know very well, I never read deeply what he wrote on this issue, but his actions really show a very different approach than many other politicians and intelligentsia in Brazil in this period regarding anti-Semitism. So I think his actions show that he was not as anti-Semitic as the environment was in Brazil, as was in many other countries in the world. And again, here I'm not saying nothing like that to sanctify one person and condemn other people. We need to look at that contextually speaking. And yeah, finally Brazil sent troops to the war. Finally Brazil sent troops to fight against fascism and Nazism. But living during a dictatorship with a quite fascist inspiration too.
Indeed.
So the paradox is more deep than we can imagine.
Yes.
No?
As it is usually with Brazil.
Yeah, exactly.
So that leads me to the other question, actually. So the achievements made by both Brazilian and British diplomats in the middle of the war in 1943 and 1944, highlighting then the enormous contribution by Brazil's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Oswaldo Aranha, to align Brazil with the Allied forces were extraordinary. I also would say that the efforts made by the diplomat and former attaché of the Embassy of Brazil in London, Aile Gadelha, your doctorate student,
Absolutely, yeah.
at King's, in resuscitating this huge historic forgotten episode by both sides of the Atlantic were formidable. Do you think that Brazil has succeeded in projecting an image of a modern country through the lenses of modernism?
I will subvert your question, if you allow me.
Of course.
I think the most and the biggest achievement from the people involved in that in 1943-44 and of Aile Gadelha here today with all the people involved in that is to prove the power of diplomacy, is to prove that in any moment of intolerance, in any moment, historical moment of divisions, conflicts, difficulties to dialogue, the power of diplomacy is the solution, first and foremost. So I think that's what this exhibition has as important to teach us. In a period of war, to work hard and bring lots of piece of art, find a place to exhibit here in London. It's a sign of goodwill to contribute to war effort. This is a huge, huge work. Some pragmatic person would say, oh, come on, let's do something easier. Let's just put a ship full of coffee and send to them. We'll be much more profitable.
The export product.
Exactly, but that would not provoke the diplomatic work that's necessary to that. And diplomatic work means solve problems, solve differences, find ways of dialogue, find ways of collaboration to a goal that is practical, an exhibition, but has a lot of consequences and results that we cannot measure. No? And that's again the situation in this exhibition today. I follow up quite close all the work hard that was in putting together this exhibition here today. And besides being a fantastic exhibition of wonderful art, of Brazilian modern art, it also shows the goodwill that the diplomacy can provoke. And this goodwill that open doors, that put people together, that break walls of misunderstanding for a common goal that will have many other consequences that we cannot measure. And those are good consequences. So I'm sorry that I subvert your question, because I really don't know if we succeed in projecting an image of a modern Brazil. but we succeed in promote an image of a country that knows how to do diplomacy, who knows how to build up bridges.
That's a really good answer, actually, to the question, Dr. Vinicius. And I do think that perhaps you also imply that culture has this enormous power to reconcile countries, nations, and people, to bring people together and countries together. I think using culture, and in this particular example, I mentioned modernism because Brazil is so, internationally recognized by its modernism or modernist art, design, architecture. But using culture in general terms to tread diplomacy.
Yeah. And
it's interesting also to talk about Brazil's role on various different conflicts around the globe, historically, in broad terms, that historically Brazil has chosen mostly for sort of peaceful solutions and diplomatic solutions, as opposed to military solutions. So it's very interesting.